President Nixon came into power because of the Southern Strategy. Go back and take a look at history, okay? History. You can learn more by reading Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class by Professor E. Hanny Lopez. A very important book to read. And basically it says this right in the introduction, that the Democrats have ignored the Southern Strategy, okay? And that's why Democrats did not do so well in November 2020. You have to learn how to speak to white America, okay? Remind them that there's one race, the human race, and that all people have a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that the programs that the Democrats have passed already, a HEROES Act, for example, right? It's going to help them, okay? But also, listen to Dr. King's speech from March 25th, 1965, where this Southern Strategy was also used right after the Civil War during Reconstruction to divide poor whites and poor blacks. Look, we're all in the same boat, okay? It doesn't matter the pigment of the skin. So the Democrats have lost so many elections. Why? It's not because of progressives. In fact, progressives have saved the Democratic Party, all right? Like progressives like Senator Bernie Sanders and others, right? Have saved it, okay? And by the way, what is progressive? It's merely following Jesus in Matthew chapter 25, right? And caring for others, showing love and compassion, and helping those who are in need. That's what America is really all about. And we need to help all people. Doesn't matter the color of skin, the class, it doesn't matter anything. We're all human beings. And by the way, all human beings on this entire earth have a right to life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Those words from Richard Nixon, the 37th U.S. president, went down in infamy and became...
Let me say something. Yes, he did, but President Nixon, just like other presidents and other people, have something called white skin privilege, right? I take an example of President Trump, right? President Obama wore a suit. They jumped on him. And look what's happened with this pandemic. How they knew about it back in, January of 2020. And if they had asked people to wear masks, from the very beginning, it wouldn't be as bad as it is right now. By the way, to the Democratic Party and to our President-elect Biden, they're going to blame you. I'm taping this right now on, today is Sunday, December 6th, 2020. They're going to blame you for the pandemic, all right? You need to remind them that this administration, the Trump administration, was aware of the pandemic back in January. President Trump wasn't. Go back to Bob Woodward's book and his tape with President Trump. Was it February 7th, 2020? Take a look where they knew how bad it was going to be, right? And remind people, you have to remind people, okay, that you didn't invent this, okay, you inherited it. Same thing with the economy, all right? So, and it's so important to speak to white America and explain to them that there's one America, there's one race, the human race. We all have a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and to defeat the Southern Strategy. That is the way that Democrats will win. In other words, Southern Strategy is what? They use racism to divide and conquer people, all right? And we're all the same.
An ironic motto for his presidency. Nixon resigned within a year of making that statement because he was, in fact, a crook, and was later pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford. But there's another key case of corruption in the Nixon administration that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Let's go back in time for a moment. The day is August the 9th, 1973. The NBC Nightly News that night leading its broadcast with a developing story involving Nixon's vice president, Spiro Theodore Agnew. Here's then NBC anchor John Chancellor.
Agnew is being investigated in connection with allegations of political kickbacks in Maryland. He is the highest-ranking official ever to be investigated by a federal prosecutor. But because no previous sitting vice president has ever been investigated, the lawyers on both sides are going slowly.
Now, that scandal eventually led to Agnew's resignation in October of that year. His demise is the subject of Rachael Maddow's new book, Bagman, which is based off of her hit podcast series of the same name. It follows the incredible story of the former vice president who many have described as Trump before Trump. The story of his corruption in 1973 was the most egregious and public scandal of any U.S. official. However, it was quickly overshadowed by Nixon's own malfeasance in Watergate. Agnew's tenure and his subsequent downfall are quite reminiscent of the guy who will be out of a job in exactly 45 days. He was a populist politician declaring war on the media, abrasive toward his enemies, and let's not forget, a blatant racist. The book is called Bagman, The Wild Crimes, Audacious Cover-Up, and Spectacular Downfall of a Brazen Crook in the White House. And joining me now for the very first TV interview about her new book, my friend, MSNBC's own Rachael Maddow. Good morning, Rachael. Thank you for being with us this morning. I'm excited about the launch of this book, and I want to talk to you about the parallels because many people see Spiro Agnew as I said, Trump before Trump. You write in your book, in fact, quote, his default setting was attack mode. He cheerfully derided liberals, the establishment, ivory tower professors, and the press. It wasn't that he was proselytizing for his own cause or for pet policy ideas. Instead, he made a marquee act out of just taking a flamethrower to the other side. So, Rachael, the similarities are easy to see between Agnew and Trump. I'm wondering what you discovered really to be the differences between the two men.
Well, Agnew got run out of Washington on a rail. Instead of just getting voted out of office, he got a second term. It's funny, Ali, seeing those clips, seeing John Chancellor talking about that, seeing Nixon in that era, it really does seem like such a more genteel time. And Agnew was sort of a much more eloquent and articulate version of Trump, I would say. No, not to cast aspersions on our current president, but Agnew used long words and long sentences with commas in them. And the feel of it is so different, but the impact of Agnew was the same. I mean, he was a raging anti-Semite. He was the most adept player of the race card in Republican politics at the time, short of Pat Buchanan. He was somebody who had no policy goals associated with him really at all. What he did was just tell Americans to hate the press, to hate the other side, to degrade them and to think of them as incapable of holding power, people who should be destroyed rather than abided. And in that way, like he really did sort of pave the way for the kind of Trump politics that we're living through now. That's part of the drama. The other part of the drama is him getting caught and what the Justice Department decided to do about it, which was absolutely every step they took was unprecedented, and they had to make value judgments and strategic judgments every step of the way. Yeah. And it was a lot of hard calls.
So let's talk about how that all went down. When prosecutors from Maryland went to the Attorney General and told him about the information they had against Agnew, the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, said that, quote, the allegations must be fully investigated. That was his quote. This is the Attorney General appointed by President Nixon, and that was his policy, which was, as you write, quote, nobody above the law squared. Now compare that to the current Attorney General, Bill Barr, and the Department of Justice. Poor Bill Barr, by the way, might be on the outs himself after carrying every bucket of water Donald Trump gave him to carry.
Yeah, and Richardson, it's amazing, was only in the office of Attorney General for 5 months. 10 days after he arranged for Spiro Agnew to leave the vice presidency, to resign the vice presidency and thereby save himself a prison term. It's only 10 days after that Nixon did the Saturday Night Massacre and forced Richardson out because Richardson wouldn't fire the Watergate prosecutor. I mean, in much the same ways that the president now demands that the Attorney General do his bidding. Nixon was absolutely incensed that Richardson wouldn't just follow him and do exactly what he wanted, no matter how corrupt. But Richardson was absolutely incorruptible, and he did fight with his prosecutors, and they were worried that Agnew should go to jail and that resigning shouldn't be enough. And they fought incredibly hard with Agnew's lawyers about whether or not Agnew could in fact be indicted if he was still a sitting vice president, if he didn't resign one of the I think very sort of newsworthy things that came out of the research for the podcast and the book is that it really does seem like this whole idea that a sitting president can't be indicted sort of came out of the Agnew case. Came out of a bunch of memos and a bunch of fighting between Nixon and Agnew and maneuvering by the two of them that led to strange and not very powerful Justice Department opinions about who can be indicted and who should be impeached instead. That's the basis for Robert Mueller, for example, concluding that Trump couldn't be indicted, he couldn't be charged, and therefore Mueller shouldn't lay out his crimes as crimes. But that was born out of this weird thing with Agnew and Nixon trying to force him out and the Justice Department trying to force him out so that Agnew didn't get elevated to the presidency when Nixon was forced out for being a criminal. I mean, it was just a disaster.
And when Mueller made that decision, he based it on a memo that had been issued by the Office of Legal Counsel. There was a similar memo in your book. The Office of Legal Counsel at the time released a memo prior to Agnew's resignation that basically said that his role was that of a cabinet-level position and that it didn't rise to the same level of the president, and thus he could be indicted while in office, referring to Agnew. It even pointed out that Aaron Burr had been indicted of the murder for the murder of Alexander Hamilton while he was vice president, and did that obligate the department? Did that way of looking at things at the time obligate the department to move forward with an indictment, even though in these days we wouldn't move forward with an indictment against Donald Trump?
Yes, and it's really important to point that out, Ali, and exactly the way you did. This whole idea that a president can't be indicted is sort of a carbuncle that grew on the side of the Agnew scandal. The reason that happened is because Nixon's sort of loyalists or officials who believed they needed to kind of serve Nixon at this time were really trying to make the argument that, okay, yeah, it's fine if you want to try to go after the vice president, but the president definitely can't be indicted. The whole argument about whether or not a president is subject to the criminal justice system should reasonably have been settled when the Supreme Court held that Nixon had to hand over the tapes, right? Nixon didn't want to hand over the White House tapes because he felt like his executive privilege and his status as president essentially rendered him immune from that. And the Supreme Court unanimously settled that and said, no, dude, you're an American citizen. You're subject to the same criminal laws and processes as all of us. And that really should have been the binding precedent that emerged out of this crisis that we had with these criminals in the White House in the 70s. But instead, because of Agnew's legal maneuvering, the maneuvering around the Agnew, what would have been a 40-count felony indictment, we ended up with these memos that I believe ended up saving Donald Trump's butt to this day, and keeping him away from any risk of jail time, at least for the next 45 days. That all grew out of this mess with Agnew.
Rachael, thank you, my friend, for joining me this morning, and thank you for the podcast, which was fantastic, and this book. Rachael Maddow is the host of MSNBC's The Rachael Maddow Show. Be sure to check out her new book, written with Michael Yarvitz. It's called Bagman: The Wild Crimes, Audacious Cover-Up, and Spectacular Downfall of a Brazen Crook in the White House. It will be available for purchase on December the 8th. Rachael, thank you again for joining me this morning, and that is a wrap in